on this computer. There we go. All right. Welcome everyone to our last webinar for the school year. My name is Ann Nutter-Kaufman, excuse me. I'm a manager in our NEA Teacher Quality Department, and we're really excited to have you here to have this discussion. So a couple of things, if we could go to the next slide so I'm not just talking off the top of my head, that would be super awesome. A couple of things, you are in a webinar format and not in a regular Zoom. So your mic is automatically muted and we're not going to see you, right? Like you can see the panelists, but you won't be able to see one another. If you have questions, you please try to put those in the Q&A, which is down at the bottom. There's a little icon that has Q&A, and we will do our best to answer your questions, or our hosts will answer them as they are able to. Let's see. We'll answer as many questions as we can during the webinar. Sometimes we have to stay a little after to try to catch everyone, but we will make sure that we do end officially on time so that we're respectful of everybody not being zoomed out. What was the word? Zoomified, zombified. It's a play on zombie. Anyway, and then the webinar is being recorded. We do have options for you to have a certificate. We will talk about how you can obtain the certificate at the end of the webinar and what you can then do with that. We have colleagues who are putting in the well, not yet, but we will be putting in the forced copy for the PowerPoint if you want to go ahead and take a look at that. And I am going to pass it to Robert Rodriguez, who is our NEA Executive Committee member joining us this evening. Robert?
Thank you, Anne. Buenas noches y bienvenidos. Good evening and welcome, NEA. My name is Robert Rodriguez, and I'm a middle school special education teacher from the great state of California and a member of the NEA Executive Committee. And on behalf of our NEA officers and the Executive Committee, it's my honor to welcome you to tonight to hear a very exciting presentation. And before we begin, we like to start all our meetings in NEA with a land acknowledgement. And so we begin by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands served by America's first people. The land where I live and teach in San Bernardino, California, is home to the Serrano and Quechua Indians, who now live on the San Manuel Band of Mission Indian Reservation. And to share a little bit about their current history, their former chief, James Ramos, is now the first elected public official in the state of California, serving in the California State Assembly. Assemblymember Ramos is a graduate of our public schools in San Bernardino and is also a champion for public education. We honor America's first people and all elders past, present, and emerging, and we are called on them to learn and share what we've learned about tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in the telling of the story of America. So thank you for allowing me to share that today. Tonight's webinar topic, Building Slides for Accessibility, is meant to help people think differently about how they are building and teaching slides. This webinar is one way that NEA is trying to support members in their professional work right now. Ensuring that our presentations are accessible by all students is something we all aspire to, but may not know exactly how to do it. So this webinar is meant to provide some guidance and suggestions on the how. How do we get that done? I also need to remind our participants that NEA is not endorsing any particular product or platform. Instead, these webinars are members talking about the tools and platforms that they have been working with for their during these online spaces. Our members are our experts, and all of our professional learning webinars are led by experienced EdTech members and staff. And at the end of this webinar, when we do the reflection, we're going to ask for you to give us some feedback. We're going to send you a short evaluation, which we use to help us identify other topics that you might be interested in. And without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to our fabulous presenters, facilitators Sarah Suhanik and Veronica Che. Take it away, folks. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Sarah Suhanik. I a 7th grade ELA teacher in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And Veronica?
And I'm Veronica Che. I am a middle school math and science teacher. Most of my background's been in high school, but this entire experience of online teaching has been in middle school. And I am also coming from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
All right, so here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk about the why of digital visual accessibility, the how, some specifics in terms of color and font, and we're going to share a template with you that you can take with you into planning your next lesson. We'll give you some examples, some pedagogical strategies, a chance to apply your skill, and then just some tips and tricks to make being online and doing this easier. I wanted to share with you some posters that I think are really useful. These are posters that were created by the UK's Home Office as a simple way to think about design for different accessibility needs. We are going to share a lot of sort of general, sort of baseline tips and things out, but at the end of the day, you have unique students in your room that have unique needs. And so some of this stuff will work better for some students than other students, and really thinking about just what design choices are most useful to your students and their particular set of needs is important.
So we, Sarah and I came together on this project way back in late August, early September, when we were all heading into this digital space, serving our students exclusively on an online platform. And we were thinking about, a lot of different steps we were taking to make sure the resources that we were sharing with our students were clear for students to consume, and we wanted to make sure that they were accessible. And we went from spending 5 hours a day per slide deck, just making a lot of different edits just to make it more accessible for our students. And then over, as time has passed, we've developed a lot of strategies and things that we just now second nature think about when we are developing our slides. So this is the why for what we're talking about today.
Yeah, Veronica cut out for a second for me, so I apologize if I repeat something she just said. So one of the things that we've noticed with creating in digital spaces is it's really tempting to go super hard on making all the choices all the time because there's so many things we have access to in terms of font and color and images. And maybe if we're not the most artistic in an analog world, like we can make those dreams come true in a digital world, right? But when it comes to digital visual accessibility, it means we're making really specific choices to be as useful to our audience as possible, and sometimes those things don't exactly line up. So we are going to look at, go ahead.
Sorry, we're going to look at a couple examples to kind of get our head around what we're trying to do. So what we're trying to avoid and what we're trying to get to. Our purpose for these next two examples is to communicate needed materials to students. So in this first example, very, very colorful, very bright. It has a nice fun font, but your eye is, I don't know if it's for everyone, but when a slide is busy like this, your eye tends to wander around the slide and you're not looking at the most important information, especially for our students. They're looking at all these different things. We're competing with their environment where they're logging in from. And so we want to make sure that our slide is conveying a clear, concise message. So instead of using that example, we are going to be talking about what various things we can do to make a slide look more like this, where each material has the picture going along with it. It's very intentional on how everything is laid out, and there's no extra busyness.
So when we create slides for students, it's to help our students access information to help them learn, right? That's the key purpose for why we're making these things. If we didn't want them to be useful, we wouldn't make them. So when students need to weed through a lot of busy or confusing things, visual messaging, it's hard for them to access the information. And this goes for all of our students, but for our students who struggle to access information the most, it's going to be exponentially more difficult.
All right, so in these next few slides, Sarah's going to show you her brilliance in finding very aesthetic color palettes and making sure that those colors are accessible. And we're going to have some concrete measures for how we call those accessible or not. And we'll go through some fonts as well.
So when we think about digital visual accessibility, there's lots of things that come to play, but there's some really good standards that we can look to. And one of those is the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guideline. So this is a free resource that helps lay out, when you're working in digital spaces, how do you make things as accessible as possible. It's got really clear metrics, and it's
Oh no.
Oh,
Sarah. Okay, wait.
Did you lose me?
I think you're back.
Okay. Sorry. It's got really clear metrics. It's got really a ton of information. But if you don't want to weed through that information, we're going to give you sort of the key basics to help out. One of the things we focus on and think about is color choice. Color choice has a huge impact in terms of the accessibility of visuals. If you have students who have a difficulty differentiating between or have trouble visually reading on a board, all kinds of different things, color can make a huge difference. One of the tools that I like to use the most is this tool, Accessible Colors. All of these are linked for you. All the images are linked for you in the, that was just to me, Veronica, sorry.
Oops, sorry.
All of them are linked to you in the slideshow as well, so everything's contained within here. But Accessible Colors put in a hex code. A hex code is the color code that each color has digitally, and we'll show you where you can find those. But you put in your text code or your hex code, you put a font you want, you put in the weight it's going to be on, the background color, and it'll tell you if these things are, you will have access to the video recording. And it'll tell you if it's compliant or not. There's 2 levels of compliance for the WCAG. One is AA and one is AAA, like the best of the best. AA, still pretty good. So this is a really useful tool if you're sort of wandering into creating your own materials and you want to choose your own colors and express yourself that way, but still make sure that the colors are accessible. Another tool that I really like to use is rulers, and it creates color palettes, and you can click through and create things. Let's see. And it will give you codes. You can play around with shades. So each of these, when I scroll over, each of these is a hex code. So if I were to copy this, it would let me, I could put it over into Accessible Colors, tell me what my content was. You can also like move through shades. If you like to play around with color, it's a really nice way to be able to sort of get these different colors and the codes that are necessary to then use them widely. And all of these things are free as well. None of these things are things you need subscriptions for or to pay for. So yeah, go ahead.
This next tool is a tool that I found very recently, and trying to grab the link for you. It's called Image Color Picker. What this will allow you to do is, let's say you are working with a color palette and there is a specific color that you're trying to get, but you can't match it with your eye. What this allows you to do is upload a picture that contains that color, and you'll be able to scan over your image and it'll pick up the hex code for you so that you can match the exact color. We had to do this very recently. And so to find what this darkest blue banner color was, so I just downloaded an image of the slide and was able to upload it here and find that. And this is a nice tool to use if you're really making sure that all your colors are matching, just because that's one thing that bothers me a lot.
And we'll talk about like why you might want your color match in a minute as well. So fonts are another thing that can have a really huge impact. There are lots of really fun, lovely, playful fonts. Those aren't necessarily the fonts we want to pick when we're trying to communicate clearly. If you've ever been subjected to 100 essays coming in where every middle schooler has picked their own font, you might understand the plight. And it's the same thing for our students, right? If they're having to weed through all the extra information and extra visual sort of stimuli that comes with fancy fonts, it's one more step between them and that information. So when we're working in digital environments in particular, sans serif fonts tend to be more readable in a digital environment. Keeping away from cursive fonts, not only do they have a lot of stuff, so a lot of our students can't read cursive anymore. They didn't learn it. And so it's a lot for them to try to navigate. Numbers, we're going to show you some fonts that have really nice, clear numbers as well. And then fancy fonts, we'll show you some that are lovely, but again, aren't useful. And when I'm talking about serifs, I'm talking about any extra sort of stuff that's existing on the ends of letters, right? So this is a serif font. We have these sort of bulbed ends, these little flippy tails, things like that, versus a sans serif font, which doesn't have any of that extra information.
All right, so we've got a couple slides here, some fonts that may be difficult for students to read, and then the next slide will be fonts that we like to use with our students. So these are just examples, and when you're looking at these examples, don't feel bad if you've used these fonts in the past. They're all beautiful things that we can use for our students. But if there's information that students really need to get out of a slide, using these fonts isn't going to facilitate that information processing for your students as easily if we're using some less fancy fonts. So a lot of these things, if you're looking at the first font, the Amatic SC, that's all in caps. So this can be confusing to some students who are learning how to write letters, and just the whole idea of capitals and lowercase letters. We have a lot of cursive fonts here where all the letters are connected. Some of them are not connected, so there's a little confusion there. And then if you're looking at a font like Shadows into Lights, if you pay really close attention to where the letters are ending at the bottom, they kind of shift up and down a little bit. So that makes it hard for your eye to follow. And it's kind of straining for your students to pick up information from that. So some fonts that we do suggest are very simple, like Sarah was saying, sans serif fonts, where the letters look, they are discrete from one another. You'll notice that a lot of these fonts, the letters are spaced apart a little bit more than in the previous slide. And this is just helping the reader read the letters and distinguish between them. Another thing I like to look out for in fonts, and this depends on the age, is the A's in fonts. That's why the Spartan example is one I use a lot, because the A looks like an A that most students are typically writing. So this is just, tiny, tiny details, but things to think about when we're thinking about how can we make our materials for students more accessible to them.
Choosing a clear font like this also, in addition to helping students read it more clearly, it can also help aid screen readers. Some screen readers have a hard time with fancy swirly fonts and are more likely to get the words wrong that way. So having nice clear writing can help a lot with a screen reader too. I have tons of students who use screen readers for various things. So I try to make sure that my stuff is all screen reader friendly so that they can grab it as much as possible.
All right, and I am a science and math teacher, so making sure students are understanding numbers is very, very important. When I'm looking for fonts for numbers, I'm looking for numbers that look like numbers that students typically write down on paper. Patrick Hand is a good one for this. I write my 7s like that, but a lot of my students don't. And that's like the one thing about it that might be a little bit tricky, but it's very hard to find a font with a 9 that just goes straight up and down. So these are just some examples that I use with my students, just so we're consistent with the numbering. So even though the font might be really great for text, sometimes the font's numbers aren't the best. So I kind of play around with different fonts when I'm choosing to represent numbers. All right. So when we're looking at the how, generally what we're trying to think about when we're making our slides or designing our learning materials for students is, if it's in a slide format, we really want to make sure that there's not a lot of extra stuff. Excess animation is really challenging for some students, because when you're creating animations and slides, in a presentation format, it's very beautiful, it's very streamlined, but a lot of times when students are reviewing your slides or they're going back to them later, they're going to go through those slides and see a slide with a whole bunch of different layers on it, and it's going to be hard for them to figure out what's going on. So avoiding some animation and just chunking things out slide by slide is going to help your students who like to go back and look at the resources. Another thing to include would be alternative text or image descriptions. This helps your students who are visually impaired or are using screen readers, so that they can get the idea of the image without any extra barriers. Another thing that we love to do, Sarah and I, and you'll see later on, is that we hyperlink everything. We make it easy for students to navigate through different documents, and it just makes the whole process more streamlined for everybody involved.
And we'll show you some different ways that we do that in a minute, and then show you some ways to make it a little easier as you go through.
Yeah. All right. And then specifically about the text on your slides. So we like to give ourselves a rule of 24 or larger. That does two things. One, it makes sure that your slides are readable, whether students are looking from their devices or they're in a classroom. The larger the font size, obviously, the easier it is for your eyes. Another thing that it does is it limits how much you can put on one slide. Sometimes we have to get that last sentence in there, and sometimes it's better to just move it to the next slide. So using a larger font size will help you put some boundaries on what you put onto just one. A couple other things to avoid. You don't want a wall of text. So if you are using like passages, and Sarah's going to explain how she projects passages to her ELA students. If it's necessary, you have to do it, right? But if at all possible, chunk it up into different pieces so that students are able to follow it without getting lost in the middle. And then lastly is to avoid text at the bottom of the slides. So there is, since we've given this, Google has updated how large this like bar that shows up at the bottom left corner is. Yeah, they've made it a lot smaller, but even even though it is a lot smaller, that text that is at the bottom of a slide can get easily blocked. If you are in a physical classroom, that's a lot of times that bottom part of your slide gets cut off by lots of different things. I think Sarah puts lots of books at the ledge of her board. And so there's a lot of books lined up at the bottom. And so we don't want any of that text getting covered up.
Yeah. It's also like if you have kids sitting in towards the back of the room, that's the part that's likely going to be the most blocked by other students' heads, right? In terms of walls of text, I'm an ELA teacher. We look at lots of texts, we put them on the board. And what I try to do, if at all possible, every so often you throw something up, you don't have time, it happens. But if I've got all my ducks in a row, I try to make sure that I have either printed copies. This is going to be our first year being a one-to-one school. So we haven't had one-to-one technology. So I always made sure I had a printed copy of those walls of text that students could mark up. I often also try to provide line numbers on the board as well as on what I give them. So that way, if I'm pointing to a word on line 5, they can go to line 5 on their own text and see that as well. We can, those are just 2 things that we can do to make it a little bit easier, especially with, big passages, poetry, stuff like that. I try to make sure we have another copy. In a digital environment, I make sure that I share a link to that specific slide so that students can and open that up on the computer if they need to, because depending on what kind of machine they are, it can end up really small, even if we do our best to make it not really small. Okay. All right, and then another thing we can try to do is to use more than one to cue students, meaning that if we're trying to communicate some information, maybe directions in particular, using multiple things to differentiate information for students is really helpful. So we don't only want to use color to point something out because if students struggle differentiating color, that's going to not be useful to them. So for instance, if I'm using if I'm and I want to highlight specific words in that passage, I'm not only going to change the color of those words. Maybe I also make them bold. Maybe I put little boxes around them. Maybe I point arrows to certain places. These are going to be ways that I can point out things in more than one way so that students can have that information translated to them in more than one way.
All right, so this is the beautiful template that we are sharing with you. And I take no credit for it. Sarah built the whole thing. And in this template that we're sharing with you, there are a few different slide types that we've included. So when you're thinking about all the things that we discussed, like size, font, color, all of these things, if these decisions are decisions you do not want to make, you want something that's AAA compliant, that's ready to go tomorrow, this is what this template is going to serve for you. So we've got, some pretty standard slide types and slide layouts for you to work around with. And these slides are targeted to make it so it's kind of like a plug and play situation. If you have a set of content slides that you are going to use later on this week, and you've learned some things from this webinar, you can take that template, put in your content, and then be confident in knowing that the color choices were intentional, the text sizes were intentional, and it just gives a nice cohesive flow and aesthetic to your slides. So Sarah can show you around what that looks like.
This was born, so I created one of these for our ELA department early this year because it was a need for us all to have a visually cohesive, UDL compliant, WACG compliant set of slides, and that's hard to make all those decisions. If you're not used to thinking about those decisions, can be challenging, and also we will, trying to do too many things at once. But also as teachers, we experience decision all the
I'm not sure if Sarah cut out for anyone else, but. Okay, sounds good. Sarah was going to say that, oh, are you back, Sarah?
I'm back. What did I miss?
We stopped at decision fatigue.
Okay. So decision fatigue is super real. The goal of these slides is to cut out choices you have to make. The choices have been made for you. If you don't want to make any more choices, you don't have to. So here are some of the choices that were made. We picked some slide categories. We have an agenda, vocabulary, learning targets, connections, and content. We've chosen little icons that align with each of these, and then a color to go with each of those. The colors written for you there, and then the hex codes are there as well. So again, if you wanted to include, say, another type of, we're going to show you where we get our icons from. Want to include a different icon and make sure it's the same color, you can make that happen. And then we have the compliant, the WCAG metrics there. You'll notice one of them, the orange, is AA compliant, not AAA compliant. To make anything in the orange yellow family AAA compliant, it has to be essentially brown. So thoughts on Bitmoji slides as a lesson trend. I think in general, that every so often having some images that are fun or playful is fine. I think having them on every slide, or having many, is confusing. I personally find the sort of Bitmoji classroom confusing to navigate. So I would say if you are only using that to get links and stuff like that to your students, maybe consider including an additional slide that has just those links written out for your students to access, because it's a lot of information. I think we can find balance between having things be enjoyable and fun and also and then there's a question about the colors. So these are all for headings or text that's over 36 point font. Okay, so that's where the compliance level is anything over 36. And some of these would work smaller. The purple would work smaller. But yeah, so we keep it mostly to headings or large text.
Just really quickly about the Bitmoji piece. I have a similar sentiment to Sarah when it comes to using the Bitmoji classroom, where it's a bunch of embedded links for students. It is not intuitive to click on a picture for me personally. And so like Sarah was saying, if that's the only thing you're using to share links, it is okay. Like we're not gonna do anything, but it is one of those things where you have to build that routine with your students if that's what you're going to do. Personally, I never made a Bitmoji classroom. It was very overwhelming and I'm a tech person. So I think that says a lot about the work that goes into creating that really beautiful like version of your classroom. But it is, it's really hard to continuously share it out, continuously update those. I think it works really well for things like our librarian has one, and I think hers works well. The counselor has one, and hers works well. So it's like things where students can access, but they're not accessing on the daily. So, do what makes sense for you, but then don't overcomplicate things if you don't have to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think. Ooh, that's a good question. So I know that screen readers can't, some screen readers can read emojis, some screen readers can't read emojis. And then the whole issue, like the creation of emoji versus like just what the image is, right? So if you're trying to convey the meaning of something, I suggest you make sure you convey that meaning. And then if you want to add an emoji, you can add an emoji. But also the trend of like many emojis, one after another, that is, if the screen reader is picking that up, is chaotic to listen to. It is like green plant, pink flower, green plant, stars, little stars, right? It like reads all of what the descriptions of what they are. And that's it's unpleasant to hear. So again, I would just be cautious, be casual, maybe be thoughtful about an actual image with an image description so it can be separated from the text. I am not a huge emoji person, I will admit, so it's not something that like comes up a lot in my practice. But I have experienced screen readers with them and I find it deeply unpleasant. So just, I guess, keep that in mind. So the template. So a screen reader, yes, we had a question about a screen reader. A screen reader is something that reads the text on a screen. There are screen readers for phones or tablets. There are different types of screen readers for computers. So your school's OT might have certain screen readers that they use with their students. A lot of our EL students have screen readers that will read the text aloud to them. So there's different kinds for different situations and they pick up on things differently. So being thoughtful. Okay, so we are going to take a quick look at the.
We're going to take a quick look at the template is what Sarah's about to say. There's a link in the chat, a bit.ly that allows you to force copy the template. So you'll have your own copy that you can make edits to. And then we're going to get back into it. There we are. I was just explaining that I put the link in there and you're going to walk us through the template. Sarah, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. I could see you and I couldn't hear you, but now I can hear you.
So I can try to talk the template if you want to like click through, or you could do it if your internet's good.
We can try.
Okay.
I don't know what's going on. No one else is in my house or using the internet. So this is what the template looks like. Here's another example of
All right, I'm gonna take over for Sarah here, just because I think she's experiencing some internet issues, which is weird. But when we're looking at the index, this is a hyperlinked index where each link is going to direct you to a specific slide in the template. So if you were to click on the learning targets, you would be able to look at the chunk of slides that are developed for learning targets. What I'm actually going to do, just because I'm not sure if we've actually lost Sarah or not, is load up the template for you so I can share with you what is going on here. So in our template, we've got, and again, this is completely built by Sarah. You have your different slide types where you've got your introduction as you're greeting students into a digital space or even a physical space. And then throughout, there's different iterations of this. So you can have an agendas or material slide that's a bulleted list, or like this half slide format, which I tend to use a lot. Another thing that is important to know about this template is that everything is color coded. So when we're thinking about, giving students more tools to associate different things, when they think about learning targets, they're like, okay, the color green, if that's one thing that gets them to associate with learning targets, or it's the image of the target itself, different points of access for our students. I noticed so I just reading in the chat, there's not a lot of background color, and that's to give a simple and streamlined design. I'm a person who really likes a lot of background sometimes, and when I first started using more simple templates, I was like, oh, I feel like it could be better, but in my mind, better was just more busy. And so this template gives you all the essential things without having it be too busy. This breakout room slide is a really great one that I use almost all the time. I frequently embed like a timer in here. So these slides are meant for you to use however you would like them, and just give you some ideas on what types of things to put in here. Sarah also compiled our frequently used icons. So she uses icons from the Noun Project, which is a nonprofit, and these are resizable. And she's got some notes in here about the color choices of, instead of using the black color, a charcoal color to make it a little bit softer on the eyes. There's a lot of other things that we use just to denote any program specific things. So we've included like a sticker bank here of different places where we grab screenshots from. So Schoology is our learning management system that we use at our school and our district. So we have our bank here, and there's some Zoom icons as well. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. The first one is, what do you think about digital notebooks for accessibility? I find I've been struggling, to be honest, with digital notebooks since teaching science. There's a lot of teachers who use a science notebook where there's a table of contents and teachers, we go page by page. That is extremely challenging in the digital space, because it almost feels like half of what you're doing is directing kids to different places. There is an example of a digital notebook in our slides, and I'll kind of talk more about it when we get there, of how to make it a little bit easier for students to navigate. And then there's another question. What about dark background with light text? I find that too much white is hard on the eyes. Absolutely. So you'll see a lot of times, you'll see slides like this where they're color blocked half with a color. If you wanted to include the whole background as the one color and use white font, that could also offset like how bright the light is. And so, do with it what you will. Do what you would like to do and what you'd like to see in your presentation.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit too. So the guidelines are actually different if it's white on color than if it's color or black on a white background, which is also part of why there's no background color, right? Is it allows for higher contrast, which is what we're really looking for in a lot of the color guidelines. So that's why you'll see in the template, if it's on a color background, it's typically a very large font with only a few words. I rarely use anything wordy that would require a lot of reading, because it's hard to read white, especially if it's smaller, if it's not bolded, if it's a skinny little text, it's really on your eyes. And I'm on the same page with Veronica in terms of digital notebooks. I think we used them for something this year for a writing project. There were parts of it I really liked, but I found my students got overwhelmed. I'm gonna share with you in a minute sort of a different sort of version of that we've been using that's been pretty effective, that's not as daunting for students.
All right, so I'll go ahead and
so there's a comment that the white background is challenging. If that's a situation for your students, that what's going on with your students, that it's more useful for you to choose maybe a softer background, I would just make sure that your contrast is still high. So that might mean if you're using a softer color background that you use almost exclusively like a black text to make sure that that contrast is really high. Because again, you know the kids in your room, you know what's going on with them. These are sort of general guidelines, but you know, make the choices that are best for the students in your room.
All right, so we're going to talk about some pedagogical strategy. Sorry, it's been a day. And getting to a lot of the questions that have just come up. So I'll let Sarah talk about this one.
Sorry, there was a question. So would you use charcoal background like slide 28 with white or another colored text? Which slide is slide 28?
I think we're talking about this slide.
Oh, you could. I typically don't, kind of across the board. Typically, if I'm going to use a dark colored text, it's very or a dark colored background, it's a very large, bold white text. I mean, you obviously can do whatever you want to do, but I typically the darker color on the white tends to be sort of the most accessible framework for it. So I would be sparing with it, I guess.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
What were we talking about? Okay. Oh, so one strategy you can use that can be really helpful for students in a classroom setting is to provide sentence stems. Some classrooms I feel like find this more useful, or it's more common practice with certain disciplines than others, but especially when I ask a question of students or I want them to do sort of a written response, I always provide sentence stems for them. It does a lot of things. A lot of times it can just help them get started. Your students who are like, I don't know what to write. I don't know. What do you want me to put? You're getting them started with some sentence stems to help them think about that. It can also help students who typically are writing more simple sentences to start to play around with a more complex sentence structure, which is a nice thing as they start to get older. But of course, make sure your sentence stems are level appropriate for your students, right? You don't want really complex sentences for your little guys because they're not there yet.
So this slide is a screenshot of my digital notebook for science. This is something that I provide for students just so they can keep up with their notebook. So they have a physical copy at home and they're writing in there, but sometimes it's hard to make the connection between what's expected and what students are actually doing when they're in their own spaces. So in your copy of the slides, there is a slide after this that goes through a video of just showing how these hyperlinks work. So if my students wanted to look up a specific vocabulary term, instead of flipping through their notebook, they could just click into the table of contents and go to the vocab. It'll get them to a landing page where they pick a specific word that they're looking for. So I try to create this teacher digital notebook so students can follow along as they're using their own notebook and just using it as a reference. So this kind of is the dream, right? For a digital notebook, we want our students to be this organized, but is that going to happen? It's hard to tell, right? But giving this support for your students, if you are trying to do a digital notebook, I think hyperlinking here is very, very useful. So we talked a lot about this earlier with the choice of colors. It's useful to make sure that there's matches between the colors you chose in your template with the things that are happening in your classroom. So I'll let Sarah speak more on this beautiful thing.
Yeah, so color coding is useful. You stay organized. It helps your students sort of be signaled as to what's being worked on. A thing we've been using recently for the most recent unit I worked on designing was incorporating, instead of a digital notebook, we've sort of used a Hyperdocs. So each of our No, that's not what I wanted. Each of our lessons has one document where students are taking notes. They're also doing their work. I'm going to share this link with Veronica so she can share it with you. But one of the things we've been doing is doing guided notes as we go through. Anytime students have guided notes, they have an orange exclamation point on my slide, and there's an orange exclamation point in their Hyperdoc, and then the spaces I want them to fill out for their guided notes. So this is what the Hyperdoc looks like. This is getting ready for our summative assessment. There's a section for each section of my slide deck. And then we have information boxes for them to write in when it's time for them to write that include sentence stems. And then we've got things listed. I can go back up. Things listed and all linked into this one document, so they don't have to go around. I found in Schoology, when I asked and with Google Classroom when we were using that, when I had students, I would be like, go to this link in Schoology. Half of them would get there, right? So when everything's in the one spot, it's a lot easier to help them navigate that way. As we go through in class, I kind of go through the Hyperdoc with them and help them figure out what they need to find out. So this is sort of for me, this has been a nice halfway point between a digital notebook and nothing. It allows us to kind of keep everything per class contained. It also helps for me with them turning stuff in. I found with digital notebooks, it was really hard with the ownership of documents and stuff like that. So this is a way for them to do that. We keep the color coding consistent with the color coding on the slides. I found it like a really nice sort of middle ground. So if you've been interested in Hyperdocs, I really encourage you to explore it because I think it's been really useful for our students. This is also a part of how we, sorry, go ahead.
I was just, keep going. I'll go after you.
But it also, our summative assessment is set up in exactly the same way. So as we move through these Hyperdocs, we're also helping them later navigate their summative assessment because they've had lots of practice with documents that look just like that.
There was a question that popped up while you're speaking about students who struggle with color blindness. Not exclusively using color coding to organize your information is how you can make sure that your materials are accessible to all of your students. So not just color coding, but also using the icons that go along with it. So that's a different visual cue that's not based in color. So trying to find lots of different layers for your students to grab at so that all of your students can access your materials. Speaking of which, this slide, it's very, very busy, I know, but we wanted to include all the different video conferencing softwares that are being commonly used. So we have Big Blue Button here, we have Zoom, and then these white ones are Google Meet. So these are just grab and go, kind of like your icon bank that we have at the end of the template, just a little bit more on there. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, so I want to make sure that we get through everything.
Wow. Okay.
Because we've got a minute, but a couple really important things that I think we wanted to share is just to make sure that we get through everything without giving you like a fire hose of information. The tips and tricks section is pretty self-explanatory in terms of what we use as everyday educators using all these different tools to make sure that we're efficient with our time and making sure that our message is getting across to our students. The only real thing that I wanted to discuss was Pear Deck. Pear Deck is a very popular, very useful, wonderful tool. I'm a huge fan of it, but something that I found by listening to my students' feedback is it's very overwhelming for students who are not in the same space as you to be navigating both a conference call and a Pear Deck screen. It has to be split screened. And a way that you can kind of work around that is by utilizing the student paced option to give your students less pressure in like a real synchronous situation. The other things that were in here, again, we're just going through, you know, what keyboard shortcuts we use, hyperlinking things in Google products, using Bitly to shorten URLs. I know I'm going very, very quickly. Creating or doing screenshots, making screenshots for your students and to teach students how to use. Yes, a lot of screenshots. A lot of times when I take screenshots, I like to zoom in and then take the screenshot so I don't lose the quality of the image. It's a lot easier to do it that way for me. And our icons. So that's pretty much all we had left that we didn't get to talk in so much detail about. But like we said earlier, everything in this slide presentation that we shared with you at the beginning is hyperlinked for you. Someone mentioned Pedagogical is terrible for screen readers. I believe it. There's a lot of things going on there. But please reach out to us if you have any clarifying questions about things, and we'd be happy to answer them for you.
Somebody asked a question about best practices for using videos in the virtual classroom. So I'm not an expert on this. I can't make any claims about that. In terms of captioning, I think honestly what I would do, ask your students how they feel about captioning. If I have students who I know are hard of hearing in my actual physical classroom, I make sure I turn the captions on. But I think for a lot of this stuff, asking your students what they need is really helpful. At the beginning of every year, I have my students fill something out that's about, and I ask them lots of questions about like, what do you need in terms of things like being able to see or being able to like, what accommodations can I do to make learning easier on you? And a lot of students will tell you stuff like that. You could also play around with like using captions one day and not using it the other day and seeing if they notice or they care, and asking for direct messages about that rather than whole class messages, especially if you work with older students, right? Okay, great. Yeah, I think especially if you're working with middle or high school students, talk to your students about what their needs are, because a lot of them are much better at articulating that. You may give them credit for it at the first bit.
Well, Sarah and Veronica, thank you so much. I learned some things. It's so fun when we visit these. I mean, when we have these webinars, because there's always nuggets that I'm really able to take. This one was less is more, which I kind of knew already, but we don't always listen. Bitmoji Classroom is too much. I watched many a friend trying to do the Bitmoji Classroom and becoming very overwhelmed and not worth it. And then that template is really awesome. Like people can just plug and play and keep moving. So that is a really, really great resource. And thank you for that. I think that the entire point here, and really not only for K-12 teaching, but I work a lot with adults, is really you have to be thoughtful about your design. And it's not something that we always think about or that we change. But it is something in this digital age where everyone are Zoom zombies and all of those things that we really have to pay a lot of attention to. So thank you very much for the webinar. It was helpful. I was private chatting with someone saying we need this for some of the folks in our staff as well, so that we all are doing some good practices. So thank you for that. Housekeeping things for everyone else. There's been some chats going on in the chat box about when the webinar and the recording. You can click on this particular link in, what slide is this? 53, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, in slide 53. And you will be asked, if you've never been there before, you will likely be prompted once you have to enroll in the webinar. I know it's weird, but it's sort of like a course. And by doing this through our LMS system, it allows us to automatically generate a certificate. So if you need a certificate, this is how you do this. If you go to this website right now, this webinar will not be there. It is still being recorded. It's going to take us a couple days to get everything translated, but if it's not there by the end of the week, then you should let us know and we'll make sure that it gets put up. We also have a form. Jen put it in the, didn't you put it? Yes, the exit ticket form is in the chat right now. It's the HTTPS forms 1. We really take your feedback from these webinars and really try to plan forward in what folks are asking for and what you may need. So if you could fill that out, we would be super duper appreciative. And those of you who have been attending these all year know that they really have been driving a lot of the content. So thank you for that. Veronica or Sarah, any last words?
Our contact information is in there. If you have any questions or want a brain to pick, feel free to shoot an email. We're happy to chat. So
awesome. Thank you all so much. I don't see any other questions, so I think we're good to go. Please fill out the exit form and visit the NEA.org website in a couple of days to obtain that certificate. Thanks everyone and have a great evening.